Mike Habib, who's come to us from just across town. You didn't get stuck in any Obama-related traffic yet because of that.
Managed to get past that. That would be great.
Cell and neurobiology, where he's in charge of basically the human anatomy teaching program there for med students. And he is, his and my past don't overlap at the same time, but we do have been to some of the same places.
Mm-hmm.
So he got his bachelor's and his master's from UVA, which I didn't go to UVA, but I grew up in Virginia, and he looks like he grew up in Maryland. And then he got his PhD in anatomy at the Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where I was a postdoc in the School of Medicine and way back when. So, and that's the functional anatomy and evolution group,
Yes.
right?
Yep.
Very good group of people. His research interests, obviously, he's done a lot of work on pterosaurs, but he does more. So he's really into biomechanics and flight, and he has done things on swarm dynamics, and he has an amazing list of research projects, research in progress, and one of which I don't even know what this is, and we probably won't talk about this today, but biologically inspired human supervision and control of agent teams, and I think he gets Department of Defense money for that, which is pretty clever. And he's also worked on aerial writing responses, or is of semi-terrestrial spiders and feathered dinosaurs and forelimbs of theropod dinosaurs and all kinds of things. So I'm looking forward to hearing his talk, as I think you all are, about the giants of the air. And is that pronounced as Ashdarkids or Asdarkids?
It's actually Ashdarkids, but it's mispronounced a lot.
Okay. Okay, thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Blair. Yes, so I'm Michael, and I will be talking, of course, about giant pterosaurs, as already was noted. And this is a core of my research program. This is a lot of what I spend my time doing, is looking at large flying reptiles, because who wouldn't want to do that? But as I do have a lot of other programs. I'll give kind of a brief introduction to myself just very quickly. Here, a little supplement. I consider this my office. So this is the Los Angeles County Museum, Natural History, and the main dinosaur hall, which I had a little bit of a part in developing, which is kind of fun. So if you see the video interactives in there, I had a part in a bunch of those. Kind of fun, so that's what my office is. I still maintain sort of an office back in Pittsburgh, because I was in Pittsburgh for 3 years. My first faculty job, and I was associate at the Carnegie Museum of Natural History, and here I am working on some wonderful pterosaurs at the Carnegie Museum with David Hone, who is a friend and co-author of mine. He and I actually just had a paper on the Carnegie pterosaurs published just about 2 months ago. It's kind of fun, so I consider that sort of the office. And then I have 2 labs. This is one of my labs. I'm a member of a field team that goes out to the Bisti region near Four Corners in New Mexico every summer. And historically, we've been going out in August, and we just determined that with the monsoons, that wasn't such a great idea. So we're going to try to move our field season up a little bit this year and do more of a July to early August field season. So we'll see. Although I have to say, one of the cool things about the monsoon season in New Mexico, if you've never done field work out there, is there's nothing quite like watching the landscape change after one of these monsoon rains. So where I usually pitch my tent is on kind of near an edge of a cliff, and I look out basically on a landscape like this, but broader view, and all you see is dry hills like this. And after a monsoon rain, I wake up in the morning and I look out and actually see lakes, and everything turns green overnight. Everything blooms. Because the plants have leaves actually will open in response to the rain. So everything, you look out and it looks like a temperate wetland for about 48 hours, and it turns back into desert. Which is pretty cool. So anyway, if you're the ecology folks here, get a kick out of that. So that's one of my labs. And then this is my other lab. And this is not one of my programs, this is just a screenshot from the tutorials because it looks nice. My stuff is just giant matrices that come out, which just people have a small stroke when they see the outputs from that sometimes. So I thought some of his graphs looked a little nicer. But this is MATLAB, of course, and is one of a couple of different computational pieces of software that I utilize, because in addition to being sort of a traditional paleontologist and comparative biologist, I am also a theoretical biologist. I'm also a theoretician. So I develop a lot of models to predict performance of living and fossil animals, and then apply them to to the known anatomy of, say, living animals or the known anatomy of fossil animals to see whether or not they validate. And then from there, you can improve your models and then use them to try to predict things you haven't yet seen. So classic theory meets observation. And that's a little bit what I'm going to talk about today. And it was already noted. I don't really need to justify myself to this crowd. It's always nice talking to a group of fellow biologists, but I also do a lot of chatting for other sorts of groups, including engineers. And sometimes people ask, they say, so who funds pterosaur research? I said, well, mostly NSF, not really an NIH guy, but in my case, actually, these guys turn out to be interested. So yeah, so I do, for the swarm stuff, I did receive a naval grant for that with 2 co-PIs, and then my latest project proposal went into DARPA. So that's kind of places that I look for money these days. So while you all are making the world a better place, I'm making it a more dangerous one. I do apologize. A little introduction to pterosaurs, though, because I'm just going to talk really today about not really the applied and let's make scary flying things part of my job, but the part I really enjoy most, which is basic biology, reconstructing history of life kinds of stuff, macroevolution kinds of stuff. So a little introduction to pterosaurs. Have 160 million year duration. So about coincident with dinosaurs. So in terms of non-avian dinosaurs at least, the last pterosaurs go extinct at the same time as the non-avian dinosaurs, 65, 66 million years ago. And the first pterosaurs show up about the same time as the first dinosaurs-ish. First vertebrates with powered flight. Let's see, all of them that we know of seem to have flown. We don't have any confirmed secondarily flightless pterosaurs, which is kind of interesting. And there's various reasons why that's probably the case, although part of it might just be sampling bias. They were quadrupedal, which is interesting. So anyone who's familiar with ground walking bats knows that bats, in addition to flying, can walk on all 4 limbs on the ground. But many individuals are more familiar with birds in their day-to-day life as modern flying vertebrates, and they're used to the walking with the legs and then flying with the wings. So I like to just put that up there because it's kind of a weird thing, and it is going to be important in what I'm going to get to in a moment. They are famous for extensive cranial ornamentation, i.e. cool crests. So why have a boring head when you can have an amazing head like this? This is an animal called Nyctosaurus. This illustration is by John Conway, incidentally. So I'm going to, throughout the talk, I will make sure that I acknowledge all of my artists. So if you're interested in who did any of these renderings, all of them are being used with explicit permission from the artists. And many of them are artists who actually work either with me or for me on projects. And that crest is known from that animal. It's preserved into 2 individuals in Nyctosaurus. So to quote my buddy David Unwin, pterosaurs laugh in the face of logic. They have enormous heads of huge crests, comparatively small bodies and went behind limbs, and these massive wings that are suspended by a large fourth digit. So if you're a pterosaur, you'd hold out your hand, you'd lick your hand, you would not have a 5th digit, very sad, but you'd have the other 4. And digits 1, 2, and 3 are not incorporated into the wing, but digit 4 is enormous. It would be about as large around as your wrist, and it'd be, depending on the species of pterosaur, as long as either the rest of your forelimb combined, or even maybe twice that long, and it would suspend the wing, and then the wing runs to the body and down to the hind limb. Exactly how it runs to the hind limb in every species is not well understood, but just sort of phylogenetic bracketing, it seems like that was the standard. And one of the things I'm going to talk about, or primary thing I'm going to talk about today, is the tendency of this group to produce giant flyers. So a fairly average middle-of-the-road Cretaceous pterosaur would have about a 3-meter wingspan. Now that's about the same wingspan as a modern royal albatross, which has the largest wingspan of any living bird. So that would be an average pterosaur. Even 4 to 5 meters is pretty common. They're not really considered to be giants amongst pterosaurs unless they're breaking 8-meter wingspans. And I'm going to show you some animals today with wingspans in excess of 10 meters. So these are, and there are multiple species in that range in multiple continents. So this was not rare for them even to hit 10 meters per se. And so that's something that is clearly different from pterosaurs, or between pterosaurs and modern flyers. Even if you include the fossil record of birds and bats, for example, there are none that are anywhere near as large as the largest pterosaurs, at least for flying forms. Of course, one of the tricky things about working with pterosaurs is they have no living descendants. So one of the nice things about working on early birds, for example, which is one of the things I also do, is that I have living derived birds to work on, and that at least gives me some idea of what I'm dealing with. With pterosaurs, it's very tough, and so the only way to really do it is use first principles of anatomy and biology and sort of general phylogenetic patterns we know apply to, say, all diapsids or something like that, along with first principles of physics and engineering, things that have to be the case because basically Newtonian physics say it has to work that way, which constrains a lot of the questions you can make, and it means that to a large extent what we end up doing is asking questions in a comparative context. So instead of trying to get absolute performance for the animals, it's more applicable and more tractable to ask how does their performance differ from another group of animals that has modern representatives, so you can compare the anatomy across. It also means that since the only thing we have of these animals at this point is, for the most part, bony anatomy with a little bit of soft tissue here and there that's preserved, we do have some nice wings from a few of them, that everything I do in the realm of building my predictive models has to have an output that is ultimately anatomical. It has to predict anatomy in some way, so that I can compare it to the fossil record and see, does my predictions hold? Because if I don't do that, I have nothing to validate against. I'm just arm waving and I can make up whatever I want, right? Well, I think they were jet propelled. Well, how do you know? Well, there would never be any evidence of that, so it's great. So I have to make some kind of anatomical prediction, and that's what I'm going to eventually come back to that. So I'm going to build the model, and then we're going to come back to some anatomical predictions. And I'm a big fan of spoilers, so I'll tell you, hey, guess what? It holds up. That's why I'm giving a talk on it. All right. Quick note about one of the major problems when it comes to sort of the size disparity in pterosaurs and birds has been, of course, trying to estimate their mass. And one of the solutions, quote unquote, that was proposed for apparent pterosaur body size in the past was, well, maybe they were very large, but we know they were pneumatic, as they had air sacs and air-filled bones throughout much of their skeleton, and so maybe they were just extremely light. And based on models that were not really derived from the anatomy, but rather from a different set of assumptions about maximum mass in flying animals, a couple of previous authors generated body masses for these giant pterosaurs around 75 kilos. As you'll see in a moment when I show you reconstruction of these animals, that would require them to be about 90% air by volume. Now, I don't know exactly what would happen if I replaced the living animal's volume with 90% air, because IOCook won't let me, but I'm pretty sure it would perish. So that's one of the immediate problems. But there's another problem with it as well, which was kind of overlooked. So this diagram is showing wing loading on the x-axis and aspect ratio of the wing on the y-axis. Wing loading is the ratio of the wing area to your body mass. So you've got big wings in a small body, you are lightly loaded. And if you have relatively small wings in terms of total area and a big body, you're heavily loaded. And aspect ratio is a shape variable, so it is the span of the wing over the average chord of the wing, which is the front to the back distance. So we take that actually as the square of the span over the wing area. That gives you aspect ratio. So long, narrow wings have high aspect ratio, short, broad wings have low aspect ratio. And the shaded in areas are morphospace analyses, two different morphospace analyses of birds. So it's showing all of the aspect ratio and all the wing loading space occupied by living birds from two very large macro data sets. And then the dotted line areas show, and they're highly extrapolated, I'll admit, because there wasn't as large samples in them, but there are pterosaur morphospaces with the giants specifically plotted on them from three different mass estimation methods. So we've got the Hazelhurst and Rayner one from the 90s, we've got the Chatterjee and Tiflin one from the early 2000s, Brower and Vidius from 1981. And what you notice is they all have incredibly low wing loadings. It pushes the wing loadings way down into spaces, in fact, where no living birds exist. Now, there's a reason for that. These particular authors said, oh, well, cost of transport is connected to wing loading, so maybe they just selected for very low cost of transport. And that, to a point, that's a very good argument. The problem is at these masses, at these really low masses and these incredibly low wing loadings, you're now into a range where in fact flight becomes very difficult, if not impossible, because it also increases your sensitivity to airflow. So the reason why you can fly at these in weak thermals, for example, with these low wing loadings, is because you're responding to a weak flow, but basically a weaker updraft. But if you're too lightly loaded, you're now basically a kite. So you just get blown everywhere. Like you have no gust alleviation ability at all. And in fact, if you live in really gusty environments, if you're a bird and live in really gusty environments, there is selection for having a very high wing loading. And this is probably why albatrosses, for example, are highly loaded birds. It's not some kind of cost. It's an adaptation to living in gusty environments. Most birds get grounded in the winds that albatrosses prefer to fly at. And one of my favorite papers is it's entitled "The Fastest Sustained Gliding Speed in a Flying Vertebrate," and it was just a one-off little paper in a kind of a backwater journal. But it's great. These guys were tracking albatrosses. They put trackers on them, and they're out on their boat, and they're tracking the albatrosses, and an Antarctic storm starts to blow off, and they had to actually get out of the way of the storm, find a safe harbor, but they continued to track one of the albatrosses that stayed in range. And all the other birds they could see visually were all being grounded or having to take shelter from this storm. And they watched this albatross on their tracking software ride the storm at an average speed of about 140 kilometers an hour for 9 hours. It ended up in South America. Every other bird for hundreds of miles is going, "Oh my God!" And this guy's going, "Yeah, I got this. Watch this." And one of the reasons they can do that is because they have a very high wing loading. Now, it also has to do with the high aspect ratio wing they have and other adaptations. But one of the key features is the high wing loading. So, low wing loading is not always quote-unquote good, and a really low wing loading is pretty objectively poor. Now, Mark Whitten developed a mass estimation method that came directly from skeletal scaling that works for living animals that he applied to pterosaurs. And he got mass estimates that were much higher, but seemed to be much more realistic in terms of the filling in viscera and things in the models, as well as the aspect ratio and wing loading scheme. So when you use his mass estimation, you put Pteranodon, a marine pterosaur, right in with the same relationship between aspect ratio and wing loading as marine birds today. And for these inland, presumably broad-winged pterosaurs like Quetzalcoatlus, we'll talk about in a moment, you put them right in with the inland thermal soaring birds. So they now map in the range that matches with the ecology that you've predicted for them based on their preservational environment and other aspects of their anatomy. The problem with this, of course, is now you have really big animals flying. So now we have to solve the size problem. So to give you an idea of just how big we're dealing with here, on the left there, far left, is a cervical vertebrae. Yes, that's not a long bone. That is a cervical vertebrae from Ehrenborgiana, from Jordan. Azhdarchid pterosaurs have these really crazy cervical vertebrae that are commonly misinterpreted as long bones. I have personally, in fact, redescribed a supposed partial ulna as very certain of this is a third cervical vertebrae from an Azhdarchid. Turned out to be a really big Azhdarchid too, because it turns out when the ulna becomes the cervical, big animal. So part of the reason they hadn't done that, they thought, no, it can't be that big. Oh, it's that big. It's not the biggest either. But that was up in Drumheller. It's pretty cool. And then there's a humerus there on just to the right of that. And you notice the scale bar there is 100 millimeters. So for those who are really good about taking individual bones, putting them in place in the anatomy, and building the whole animal out of them, I give you these with scale. But for those who would like a little bit more of a scale, here's a human next to the humerus for scale. That is Doug Lawson, the discoverer of Quetzalcoatlus northropi from Texas. That's the original holotype humerus. So that gives you a little better idea of scale. But I imagine if you're like me, you like a more complete visual. So here's a reconstruction from Mark Whitten. That is his fiancée, Georgia there. She's about my height. That is a very large male Maasai giraffe. And the large Azhdarchid there can just about look it in the eye. Now, it would not have anywhere near the mass of that giraffe, because the Azhdarchid, even more than the giraffe, is almost entirely head and neck. It's basically a flying head and neck in terms of length. The skull on these animals, from the ones at least we have post-cranial and cranial remains of, including Quetzalcoatlus proper, is about 4 times the length of the shoulder to hip distance. So they are, and then the neck is as long or longer than the skull. So they are kind of like flying heads. But that does make them very tall, and nonetheless, even with that smaller torso, even with a lower mass, which Mark estimates for this animal of about 250 kilos, you still have the issue of a 250 kilo flying animal, which leads 2 possibilities. One is, it wasn't a flying animal, it was a secondarily flightless animal, but there are multiple aspects of the anatomy that suggest that these animals could fly. There is no reduction in the wing. The wing is, in fact, more proportionally robust than the big guys and the little guys. So you've got positive allometry there in the wing, and not just in the wing overall, but in parts of the wing that you'd be associated with flight and not necessarily with walking. There's also expansion for pectoral muscle mass in ways that, again, for the adductor muscle mass is proportionally greater as you get into the bigger Azhdarchids, which again would make a whole lot of sense if they were flightless. And there is also the general scheme that while, and this is, I admit, a little bit more speculative, but while they were probably relatively competent on the ground, much more so than has often been proposed in the past or modeled in the past, these were still probably not highly cursorial animals. And for a relatively non-cursorial animal at 250 kilos to stand toe-to-toe, because it's tall enough, it's not going to be hiding in the bushes, with 5-ton tyrannosaurid predators in the late Cretaceous inland environments, because remember this is a continental animal, it's not an island animal, is unable to fly to retreat seems a little bit far-fetched, although I admit that sometimes animals do things we don't expect. So that's circumstantial, but the other parts are not. And it's also worth noting that other large pterosaurs, not necessarily ashdarchids, but some others that do still get quite large, like 7-meter wingspan pteranodon, are found in environments that they basically only could have flown to. They're found they were preserved in aquatic sediments pretty far from land. That was later uplifted, but they basically died on the continental shelf, and they don't have aquatic adaptations, so they must have flown out there. Which then leads to the question, well, what does it take to make a giant flyer? Because the largest flying bird in both fossil and modern history, if you combine the entire history of birds that's known, is this thing called Argentavis. It's the only particularly large fossil bird that is still thought to have been volant, based again on comparative anatomy. And its mass estimation is around 75 kilos, which is pretty good for a bird, but it still falls way short of 250 kilos. And there are no bats that are particularly large in the modern or fossil records. About a kilo and a half is about their max that's observed. Of course, I'll get to the difference between observed maximum and mechanical maximum as we go along. So this is also by Mark Whitten. These are some silhouettes of some of the largest members of individual clades of pterosaurs, except for the lower right, which is a hypothetical giant. And this was from a presentation he gave where he's basically talking about how big could they get. And there have been proposals in the past that they have found animals with 12-meter wingspans. Turned out not to be the case, but that did raise the question of, well, would a 12-meter wingspan flying pterosaur be possible? Can we constrain what's possible for flight? And one of the first things you have to do, of course, to do this sort of analysis is to have a good anatomical reconstruction for ashdarchid, and I'm picking Quetzalcoatlus here because we have a lot of remains of it. And unfortunately, there aren't many. And this has to do with a kind of a weird happenstance of just not enough individuals doing these kinds of formal reconstructions, really measured carefully of pterosaurs in general, but particularly for ashdarchids because the few species that are known from multiple complete or near complete individuals are not always particularly accessible. I had the great fortune of having access to the ones in Texas. Very few individuals did. And so very few individuals have actually been able to do proper measured reconstructions of Quetzalcoatlus. And that's why if you look online, if you do a Google image search, something like that, the vast majority, 90-some% of every Quetzalcoatlus reconstruction you'll see on there is just flat out incorrect. It just does not have the right proportions. Because the poor artist who is told, we're writing a book and we want you to draw a Quetzalcoatlus. And they go, what does it look like? They go, well, it's a big pterosaur. Can you be more specific? And the response was, no, we can't because we don't have any measurements. So those poor artists had to just guess, and they made something that looked cool, and that was that. That's all they could do. So it's not their fault. But I fortunately do have measurements, and so here's a few of the highlights. Quetzalcoatlus, and notice I say SP because I'm working with these smaller individuals that are probably juveniles of the giant, although maybe not. They could just be closely related to taxa, so there is some uncertainty there. But they're the ones that we have multiple complete skeletons of. So we have about half a dozen of them, and then we just have the wing from the supergiant one. So there is going to be a scaling problem here. I am extrapolating. I'm going to be just full disclosure. I'm extrapolating from a piddling 5-meter wingspan animal to the 10-meter wingspan guys. So they're still very big. And you can do full analysis on the 5-meter wingspan guys. It's really cool because they're still huge by flying animal standards. And a lot of what I do is just works just directly on the little guy because he's still huge and awesome. But if we do want to look at the maximum limit stuff, we have to do some extrapolation, at least look at what's plausible. All right. So it has total neck length of about 1.48 meters. Humeral length is about 0.23. Got a good idea of the trunk length because we got most of the dorsals and some of the rib material from it. We also have the scapulocoracoid, which helps. So the neck is about 4 times the length of the shoulder to hip distance. Interestingly enough, and this is something you don't see very often in any pterosaur reconstruction, so I'm going to put out a plea here for reconstructing your pterosaur necks properly, because I know after this talk, everyone in here is going to be a pterosaur worker, right? You're all going to go out, we're all going to do pterosaur, yeah, good, excellent, perfect. So when you do your pterosaur reconstructions, note that the hyoids of these animals are really quite long, And we know from comparative anatomy the hyoid muscle should attach to the larynx and then down to the sternum. And if you use those contours, if you know a little bit of comparative anatomy and you look at the bony landmarks in these animals, and you consider how strong the cervical vertebrae really are in bending, about twice as strong as the femur, in fact, these animals, what you find is that, these animals probably don't have particularly wimpy necks. And what you see if you look in a lot of the literature, in a lot of old books, a lot of image searches online, is you see skinny necks with a tiny bit of muscle on them and then shrink-wrapped skin. They've actually left off the entire anterior compartment in those reconstructions. There's no trachea, there's no esophagus, there's no pharynx, there's no hyoid. It's just gone. It just doesn't exist. It'd be like an old kung fu movie. Someone ripped your anterior compartment out, right? So now I sound violent. I apologize. But regardless, the anterior compartment is missing in these animals, and in most of those reconstructions. And even the shrink wrapping onto the muscular compartment, the muscular axial posterior neck, is sort of underestimated, probably underestimated. Actually, we know it's underestimated because you can't even fit the neck vertebrae in a lot of them. They think, oh, the long, skinny neck vertebrae. Well, yes, the spinous process is reduced, but the shaft of the vertebrae isn't that small, and the zygapophyses are enormous. They're actually interlocked, so they don't have many cervical vertebrae. There are 9 of them total in the long neck Ashdarchids. And the cervical vertebrae up by the head and the ones at the base of the neck are relatively short and kind of normal looking, and most of the length is from the middle 6 or so of them. And so cervical 5 is super long, and it's interlocked. For example, it's the middlemost one, and it's locked in on either side with 4 and 6. So it's basically a pole. But those interlocking zygapophyses are flared quite a bit, and there's muscle that attaches in tetrapods to zygapophyses. So if you put all that on, what you find is the neck can't be that thin, and the head is enormous. It's just that the torso is normal, and the hind limbs are normal. So we can look at a couple of the skulls here. So this is actually a overlay of multiple skulls that I basically did landmarks on and pieced them together. I took off the landmark points because it gets a little bit visually difficult and just showed the overlay here. You can put a little bit of a basic contour in there based on hyoids from other. We don't have a hyoid from Quetzalcoatlus, by the way, but we have hyoids from relatives, and they're pretty consistent pterosaurs. So you get an idea of the head and neck, and we have an idea of the torso length and everything, and put together this. So this is by David Krentz. I just kindly included his watermark on there, which is great. And this is, as far as we have at the moment, the most complete and most accurate, as far as we know, so it's most precisely measured reconstruction of an Ashdarchid pterosaur that's out there, certainly of Quetzalcoatlus. And you'll notice a few things about this. First of all, this isn't as big an animal as a lot of the reconstructions suggest. That's why it can be the height of a giraffe and only 250 kilos. It's really not that big. It's just, again, has a lot of head and neck. I should also note that this would not be the stable flight position for this animal. It would have a negative pitching moment if it flew in this position. The wings would have to have a forward sweep. They have to be held with a forward sweep in order to bring the center of lift coincident with the center of mass. I didn't do that in this illustration, or I didn't have David do that in this illustration because I didn't want in the lateral view to occlude the head and neck for the animal. I want you to be able to see the full length of that because I think it's awesome. And also this is a better standardized anatomical position. But the wings would have to come forward, so we've learned that from doing this reconstruction. And one thing we also are able to do is there are a couple different ways of mapping muscle onto the origin insertion points on these bones. We know roughly where most of them should go. There's some nice muscle scars on a lot of the elements. And you can get kind of a low-end volume estimate and a large-end volume estimate, and sort of we kind of take the median of that. And effectively what you get is that the flight muscles in this animal are probably about 30% of its mass. Now the average in a bird is like 13 to 14%. Actually, it's probably closer to 16% because there's some secondary flightless birds that I think are in that data set that probably should be excluded if you're going to look at flight muscle mass really. But still, low to mid-teens. Sort of the average for birds. 30% is known. There are some game birds that get up near 30%, hummingbirds around 30%, but 30% flight muscle mass is quite high. It probably has to be this large and fly, but it's one of the reasons they can get big. So right now we've already fixed one of the problems, or we've answered part of our question of how do you make a giant flyer. One is you have a build that is highly hypertrophied in the appendicular part of your body without being particularly hypertrophied in the axial skeleton, other than in this case the head. But at least the torso and abdomen, where a lot of the mass would be, is pretty normal. They've just made the limbs really big and they've expanded the muscle compartments. So these animals have a disproportionate amount of muscle, or had a disproportionate amount of muscle. for flight. And that allows us to check a few things. So again, this is consistent with current body mass estimations of 180 to 260 kilos, so it matches the range you get from Martin, Paul, and Witten, for example. All these different methods all get similar masses. This gives you that kind of mass if you do a soft tissue volumetric slicing kind of reconstruction. Yields about 30% body mass as flight muscle, which is going to be interesting, already interesting, going to be more interesting in a moment. Provides space for all the required anatomy, so the anterior neck in particular is present now, which is nice. Matches the skull shape and body proportions. And there's things that may need to be updated. There's maybe pneumaticity in the wing that we haven't put in yet. There might be a little bit of what we call fairing that kind of smooths out the transition of the spar, the bone and muscle in the wing to the skeletal muscle in the wing to the wing membrane, which probably had some skeletal muscle, maybe some smooth muscle in it as well. And there might be a nacelle of kind of fat and other tissue behind the elbow. There's some evidence for that in a couple other pterosaurs. But on the whole, it's going to be pretty complete. And now so we can start to look at some of the possible restrictions on flight. So is the limit flapping power? That seems reasonable. Like maybe as you get bigger, your power available for flapping tends to decline. Well, it will on average, but maybe not as fast as we'd think. So Colin Palmer has done some nice synthetic pterosaur wing wind tunnel experimentation. He basically finds that even conservatively, they should get a lift-to-drag ratio of about 15, probably better than that. And a 200 kilo Quetzalcoatlus, I'm using sort of the middle of those mass estimates from before, require about 2,600 watts of power in level flight at that lift-to-drag ratio in order to maintain level flight. Well, this new reconstruction gives it 60 kilos of muscle, and a conservative estimate for the muscle output in these animals would be about 200 watts per kilo. I'll explain how I get that in a second. That's 3 times the required power for level flight, so it has room for level flight and for plenty for climb. So it is not being limited by flapping power, as far as we can tell. Now, it is still limited on endurance flapping power because the 200 watts per kilo is a conservative estimate for anaerobic power. Turns out that in flying animals, this is something that Martin worked out in the mid-90s to late 90s, that in flying animals, the anaerobic fraction in the flight muscle rises pretty steadily and actually with a very predictable pattern as body size goes up. And there's a single curve that you can, for which he wrote an equation that describes this for everything from insects through bats and birds, and then he said proposed would probably therefore predict for pterosaurs. What this means is that as you get very large as a flyer, you end up with a lot of fast twitch that is anaerobic muscle and not in your flight muscle fraction, and not a lot of aerobic muscle. So you can't flap continuously, you can only flap for bursts. But here's the nice thing about flying. When you stop flapping, you don't stop moving. So if you can switch from flapping bursts to soaring, and modern flap gliding animals do this, large ones do this, then you can stay aloft even if you're mostly anaerobic under anaerobic power. There are living birds that cannot flap continuously for more than a few minutes. They fly just fine for hundreds and hundreds of miles. They just don't flap continuously for the whole time. They flap for 20% or less of the time they're in the air. So you have to be able to flap and then rest. Now the 200 watts per kilogram from that comes from just taking a very conservative approach. The most conservative approach for the muscle here would say that, okay, there's a simple, the power output is proportional to the cross-sectional area because the force would be, and we're assuming power is proportional to the force, which it might not be. That's why it's conservative. We'll get to in a moment. Cross-sectional area of the muscle gives you the force. The volume of the muscle is related to its mass. So basically, as you get larger, you get a 2/3 scaling problem. And if you do that, if you apply that estimate to the kind of fast twitch muscle you have in modern crocs or modern fast twitch bird muscle, which would be a bracket for pterosaurs, you go from they get about 400 watts per kilo for the big ones. This size, you'd be expected down to about 200 watts per kilo. However, I did mention it's conservative, and the reason it's conservative is that's doing what you expect to be the raw force output. But for power output, you also have to take into account the time, the rate of strain, how quickly the muscles shorten. And as it turns out, the power output doesn't taper off as fast as the force output because at large sizes they can actually shorten the muscles a little faster. So the muscles actually shorten a little fast. They have higher strain, even though they have the cross-sectional area problem. So the power does drop off, but it doesn't drop off as quickly. So I'm pretending that they have no strain advantage, but it's not actually true in living animals. So it probably wasn't true in pterosaurs either. So it has at least 3 times the required power for level flight. All right, so that's not limiting. Darn. Okay, well, let's see what else might be limiting. Well, another possibility, something that might be limiting, we thought, oh, well, maybe what's limiting is the dimensions of the bones in the limb. That in order to withstand the forces of flight, you have to have the bones require a certain amount of stiffness and strength. But as they get particularly large diameters to maintain their stiffness and strength, what ends up happening is you no longer have a good wing. Your lift-to-drag ratio tanks, and so you've got a catch-22. You can't have a wing that's efficient enough to fly and still be strong enough to fly. That's also a reasonable possible constraint. And so you can look at something called the cross-sectional properties, or in this particular case, the second moment of inertia of bones. And these are not bone CTs, but they would look very similar here. This is just a hypothetical perfect circular section just to make the point. If it was actually perfectly circular, then this gives you the second moment of inertia about the x and y axes, which is directly proportional to bending stiffness in a beam, which long bones are pretty decent beams in most cases, especially if they're pretty straight. But you actually do an integration instead because it's usually not a perfect circular section. And I did a bunch of cross-sectional property work for my dissertation years ago on birds. Got some pterosaurs as well, compared them to the birds. Thought that would be a good, and some bats as well. Thought that would be a good three-way comparison. See what we got. And basically, bottom line was, eventually that would be limiting, but it'd be limiting at an enormous size, way bigger than any large pterosaurs that we've found so far. So it doesn't seem like that's actually limiting. It would be eventually, but that does not seem to be the limiting case. But there is as a side effect of this analysis, something else jumps out. And that is, I not only looked at the cross-sectional properties of the forelimbs, I also looked at the cross-sectional properties of long bones in the hind limbs. So this is the section modulus, which is similar to second moment of inertia, but this is actually proportional to strength rather than stiffness of the bones. And this is the ratio of the section modulus, hence no units, that's dimensionless, of the humerus to the femur in pterosaurs, and I've just got birds on here. It was getting a little squeezed adding the bats too, but pterosaurs, flying birds, and flightless birds. And what you'll see is that the ratio gap between even the lowest ratio pterosaurs and the highest ratio birds is much larger than the gap between flightless birds and the lowest ratio flying birds. In other words, pterosaurs have enormously strong humeri relative to their femora from what you could expect from birds. And more to the point, they scale in the opposite direction. In birds, the scaling exponent on the femoral strength is greater than the humeral strength. Big birds have stronger femora than humeri. In pterosaurs, the humerus is always stronger than the femur, and as they get bigger, the gap grows. They're scaling in the opposite direction. The only living flying animals that do something like that are bats. The humerus is always stronger than the femur, and they scale also in the opposite direction, so the ratios are somewhat similar. Now, there's a little bit of trick in terms of comparing them there, because bats don't get as large and they don't have pneumatized bones. So they have a similar kind of pattern, but the overall pattern of stiffness relative to bone length is a little bit different. You have to calibrate it differently than the simple ratio, and that's why I've just got the two-way comparison here, because, like I said, you end up with a more complicated metric, but the bottom line is that bats hold that same pattern as the pterosaurs. In any case, this then leads to an interesting caveat about the final and probably winner for limitations on or limiting. One of those two would have worked, but the combination didn't. That wasn't good. For the limitations on flight in animals, particularly body size, that is, and flight. And that is takeoff. And interestingly enough, takeoff in flying animals is basically jumping. Robert Dudley and I, he's from Berkeley, he works on insect flight primarily, for those who know his work. Wrote an amazing book on insect flight years ago, one of the best animal flight books ever written. Incidentally, he just published a new book, which is arguably better, although a completely different subject, but it's a total winner. It's on the evolutionary history of alcohol use in the animal kingdom. It's really cool. It's called The Drunken Monkey. It's brilliant. He just came. I invited him to give I organized a bioflyer symposium at the experimental biology meetings in San Diego last week, and he was one of my speakers, and he and I were talking about it over dinner. It's really cool. Nothing like having sangria and saying that it's a work activity. He's researching. It's great. Any case, so takeoff in animals. Anyway, so Robert Dudley and I are looking at something, a joint paper called "Flight is Jumping, Flight is Leaping," because that's basically it. It's just that some of them stay up longer than the rest. Launch, at least, is leaping, and they're essentially ballistic. So in birds, 80 to 90% of the launch force is produced by leaping. A number of individuals have shown this, Hepner and Anderson's, seminal paper in the mid-80s, Bonser and Rayner. Earls did probably the best of them in 2000 with starlings and quail. And then Tobolewski et al. Did a great piece of work, 2004, where they did show that one group of birds, at least the one study group they used, did get about equal launch force from the wings and the hind limbs. So full disclosure, there is a group of birds that is not 80 to 90%. But it was hummingbirds, which you might expect to get almost nothing from the hind limbs. They're a member of an order called Apodoformes. It means no feet, because you can barely see their feet externally. They're still getting half their launch force from leaping. Gliding mammals take off by leaping. Launch force is up to 10 times body weight. Nice work by Paskins there. Gliding snakes. Any ophidiophobes in the group? Anyone who doesn't particularly like snakes? I'm about to make your life a lot worse. Okay, yeah. There are Southeast Asian snakes, genus Chrysopelea, that glide. And they're also the only ones that can jump. They've secondarily derived the ability to leap. They're the only truly leaping snakes. That's how important leaping is for launch and flight. That the only group of snakes that can leap is also the ones that can fly. So for those who don't like snakes, I've now added leaping and flying to the things that snakes can do. I apologize. I happen to love snakes, so I think it's great. I almost raised a couple of these back in the day. And Jake Soka is the world expert on those. He worked with LaBarbera in Chicago, and he's now working with Lorena Barba on a cool CFD project with flying snakes. She was at GW. So if you're interested in flying snakes, those are the people to talk to. And then with bats, they are a little different. They either launch from the ground quadrupedally by leaping, so they fit the pattern, or they launch from a ceiling. Now this is the one exception, but it's the exception that makes the rule. So the same body of theory that I was able to use to predict this, because one thing I didn't let on is actually I predicted that this was going to be the case even before I looked at the experimental results from these other groups. You can predict from basic fluid theory that they should leap, they should be ballistic to launch. I also predicted from that, and I'm not the only one, a couple others did as well, that bats should not just be dropping from ceilings. What they should be doing is flapping before they let go, and they do. They complete about 2.5 to 3 wing beat cycles before they let go of the ceiling. They're effectively already flying. They already have a bound vortex on the wing before they bother to let go of the branch. Okay. So, or ceiling, what have you. And you can see the effect of this if you watch giant flying foxes take off either in captivity, or if you have the great fortune to go watch them taking off of trees in Australia. The branches recoil quite heavily when they take off. Now they're big for bats, but they're not that big. They're only like a kilo apiece. A kilo of body mass dropping off a branch is not going to make these things recoil like that. They're generating multiple body masses, body weights, I should say, on these branches, and that's why they're clearly recoiling. And of course, you can measure this in a lab context. Everyone's looking for a really cool flight animal dissertation project. By the way, no one has yet done that directly in terms of real force measurements on perches properly for bats. We have the kinematics to show they complete the wing cycles, but we don't have the force data. Hint, hint. So you want to think about doing that. Here's a flying snake, because I wanted to pick what I think is the most awesome of that list, and also the one that's most likely to terrify some members of the audience. And here's some birds taking off. So now we get to the part where I contrast birds to pterosaurs. So basically, the problem before the pterosaur launch models was they were assuming that they were glorified birds, and this is why they thought the largest they could be was 75 kilos, even though that makes them mostly air by volume. And what was sort of misunderstood was birds do not flap themselves into the air, they jump themselves into the air. And what we see here is just a small section of hundreds and hundreds of images you can find by, say, crowdsourcing through Flickr. So it's kind of a nice crowdsourcing data collection. Just find every picture you can of a bird right at takeoff with the feet are still touching the ground, and tons and tons of pictures. And what you find is as the toes are toeing off, the wings are up. The wings aren't coming down; they're going up. They're just the only one here where the toes come off is this crow down here, and he's the only one who the wings are coming down. Everyone else, the wings are going up. So the wings hit their apex at the toe off, and then they come down. So they jump first, and then they flap. And as I already mentioned, if you apply this model to pterosaurs, you get the same 75 kilo mass estimate. So that we had before, so that's no good. But there is another way of doing it, as I already alluded to, and you can do it this way. This is a vampire bat, another one of my all-time favorite animals because, well, it's a vampire bat. And they're awesome. In addition to sanguivary, which is pretty cool and neat, as an evolutionary adaptation, they also are quadrupedal leapers. So they leap very nicely from the ground. Even with large blood meals, if they get too big, they are actually grounded for a little while until they can pass enough water. But with a moderately heavy blood meal, they can still launch at a very high wing loading. And they get this heavy mass from feeding because blood is mostly water, which is heavy. But they can still launch because they have this incredible quadrupedal launch system where they use the forelimbs for most of the power. So the hind limbs punch off first, they get a little power from them, and then the wings punch off because they're still touching the ground, and that gives them the huge leap. And then they do a full upstroke and downstroke while they're still ballistic. And so then what you can do is you can say, okay, well, we know something about flapping frequency in animals and how that scales across body size for all flapping flyers. There's some basic fluid dynamic constraints for that. So we know how long that initial upstroke is going to take. So that's the penalty you pay for doing the quad launch, right? You add an extra upstroke in there. So we know the timing penalty, and we know something about ballistics, and ballistic trajectories from angle and power are very simple to calculate. So we know if we have some idea of the power we think these animals are generating, we have an idea of whether they can pay for the timing penalty or not. And the overwhelming answer is that they can, without any problem at all, basically. Bats are better launchers than birds of similar size. They get much higher. They have more time for clearance of the wings than birds do, in fact, even though they have to add the extra upstroke. And it appears to be the same for pterosaurs. Now, just as a reminder, we know they're quadrupedal, and we know they're quadrupedal because of trackways. More wonderful artwork from Mark Whitten, reconstruction on the right of them walking along an ancient sandbar, figure from a paper of the trackways on the left, and then an actual photo of the trackway outlined in chalk there in the middle. And incidentally, they have the reason the trackways look so weird for the mantis prints is they're walking on those 3 fingers that are not part of the wing, but they're walking with them like this, basically a supinated position. So the third digit's actually pointing backwards, which is why we know they're pterosaur tracks, because they're the only things that can leave tracks that way. The pes prints look pretty generic, if you will, for a tetrapod, but the mantis prints are just bizarre. Again, pterosaurs laugh in the face of logic. So we have an idea of what kind of launch acceleration you would require. We have an idea of what the launch time is likely to be, because it turns out in living animals, launch time has a pretty tight correlation with flapping frequency. Not entirely, but it's pretty well correlated, and that's probably because the limbs, it's all about limb speed, is how fast they can move the limbs. And we have an idea for how fast the initial upstroke would be. And this wonderful piece of work by Julia Molnar shows Anangara, another relatively large pterosaur over 5-meter wingspan, going through the vault portion of what I propose to be a quadrupedal launch, what I call a vault ballistic launch. And if you model them in that manner, so you get sort of the old reconstruction, 2006, and Mark's updated 2013 quad launching Quetzalcoatlus. If you update them, the maximum size it seems to be mechanically possible is a little over 300 kilos. If you use less conservative power estimates, up to more like 400 kilos. That's still much larger than any ones we've seen, but it's not so large as to be off the chart anymore, which implies that is the constraint, that it is takeoff. And you'll note that the 75 kilo maximum for the bipedal launch is about the size of the largest known flying bird. Argentavis is estimated to be about 75 kilos. So it's probably near the bipedal launch maximum. Probably closer to its maximum than large-edged darkids were to theirs, oddly enough, because your absolute size is not necessarily a measure of how close you are to your mechanical limit. And it's likely that a lot of pterosaurs did this. Nice image from Mark Whitten's book that just came out on pterosaurs. And so our answer to what it takes to make a giant flyer is membrane wings help, which I didn't get into in this particular talk, but it turns out there's some really cool dynamics in membrane wings. Allow you to get large lift coefficients, so that helps you be big. Pneumaticity, which I mentioned in passing, but also talked about the stiffness of the bones. So the reason you can keep the bones really stiff without being overly massive is you can fill them with air. That's what's holding bats back, by the way. They have membrane wings and they have quadrupedal launch, but they don't have pneumaticity. And quadrupedal launch. Those are the 3 things that really seem, if you've got those 3 things, you can probably be a giant flyer. If there's a 4th thing, and the 4th thing is an ecological advantage to being enormous, of course. Because just because you can be big doesn't mean that there will be selection to be big. And I think one of the reasons that there's so many big pterosaurs in the late Cretaceous is the largest ones in particular, the ones that are being very large, are mostly these ashdarkoids, the superfamily Ashdarkoidea, especially ashdarkids, which are all inland, so we're going to tell pretty much inland terrestrial, probably ground hunters. Now, they're all built to eat relatively large numbers of small prey. We know that because their GI system had to be short because they have a small abdomen, okay? And also the structure of the jaws. They appear to have been eating lots of small prey. Well, was the Cretaceous, for some weird reason, a particularly good source of small terrestrial defenseless prey? Yeah. Actually, probably baby dinosaurs. would be the thing that's really different. So some mammals possibly would go down the gullet from time to time, but they're small mammals now. What was really different in the late Cretaceous is the large animals, the big size dominant terrestrial animals of the time, all had small babies. And we only have evidence for parental care in a relatively small number of them. And we have clutch sizes for a lot of them. And we know they couldn't be that big because there's a maximum on size on hard-shelled eggs. So the late Cretaceous is an entire sea of small meatball-sized things, of which we know not many of them made it to adulthood, probably because they got eaten, probably a lot by flying ninjas that drop out of the sky and eat them alive. And we have to remember as well that predation in juveniles is an incredibly important part of ecology in general. We know in modern ecology, predators prefer the juveniles of large animals over the adults of smaller ones. Lions preferentially kill juveniles of large herbivores that they usually wouldn't attack as adults over the adults of the smaller herbivores because juveniles are naive. They don't have good escape behaviors yet. They're easy to catch. The late Cretaceous was basically a sea of walking stupid meat. And I suspect that these guys were munching a lot of them, which may explain the last part of the advantage to being so large. And so I'll leave you this wonderful illustration, fully rendered by David Krentz, of two Quetzalcoatlus soaring over the Mesozoic inland portion of the United States, looking for small meatball-sized baby dinosaurs to eat. And with that, I will thank some individuals who have given me access to specimens, various museum curators and collections managers, as well as individuals who helped train me and give me advice. And perhaps most importantly, to Dr. Juan Langston Jr., who died almost exactly a year ago, unfortunately. So a special shout out to him. He was one of the most important mentors to me in pterosaur biology, and he's also an individual who gave me access to and training on the anatomy of Quetzalcoatlus. So with that, I'll take whatever questions you happen to have.
What do you know about vision?
Not a lot. We have some endocast work that's been done by Larry Whitmer's lab that implies that the optic region of the brain was pretty well developed, but it's actually hard to make that out versus other areas in an endocast. Orbits are not anything outstanding, but they're not particularly small either. They're kind of average-ish for an archosaur, but archosaurs on average have good vision. So probably pretty decent vision. We'd expect them to be visually dominated. There is one group of pterosaurs that has really huge eyes called neuronathids, which means frog mouth. So these flat faces, big mouths that kind of look like Pac-Man with tiny little teeth and massive eyes. And then we know they were very furry, actually, because they have a lot of integument preserving them, so they're a little big-eyed flying fuzzballs. They're the only ones for which we have direct evidence for having some kind of unusual visual apparatus. Otherwise, probably very good vision as vertebrates go, but nothing out of the ordinary for an archosaur.
Really interesting topic.
Thank you.
What about the head? I mean, it's kind of the elephant in the room, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like, yeah, the neck. Does that help with the launching, or how do you justify that enormous?
I have no idea. If you can solve that problem, you will solve a major problem in pterosaur research. I really don't know. I should say no idea is not quite right. I don't know. No one knows. They could use raising the head to help offset the cost of the head, but it still is a net cost. It's really better not to have the huge head, especially in flight. And in launching, it's not a huge net cost, but it's still a net cost. So it's a costly structure for almost all the locomotor stuff. So presumably it's advantageous somewhere else. Now, I said I have no idea. That's not quite true. With the stiff neck, having the long jaws is important to be able to reach the ground to catch prey because they actually can't flex. They can't flex the neck. So they have a pull. So actually, there has to be a correlation between the length of the neck and the length of the jaws, which there is in Astarchids. That said, they're not the only ones with huge heads. Pterodactyloid pterosaurs, the derived pterosaurs, which is basically most of the Cretaceous diversity of pterosaurs, possibly all of it, depending on which phylogeny you use. They all pretty much universally have big heads. Some of them have like what the heck is wrong with you heads and like looks like a Rose Bowl float, and others have a sort of, well, that's still slightly alarming sized heads. They're all big. It's not something that's been worked on a lot, I think in part because how big the heads really are is something you only notice if you do proper measurements. And unfortunately what happens in a lot of reconstructions, which, you know, even if it's supposed to be a popular reconstruction, let's face it, it influences the way we think, right? I mean, if you see it in a magazine, you see it in Scientific American, it just influences the way you think. And And having done consulting now for multiple television shows and a film and a bunch of magazines, I can tell you what happens every time I give them an accurate rendered illustration here from one of my artists or myself of one of these animals. Well, the head wasn't that big, right? No, it was. Well, can we make it a little smaller? No. That's how big it is. But no one's going to believe that. Not my problem. And then when you're not looking, they shrink the head. They hit it with the shrink ray. They have every pterosaur inclusive show, every dinosaur show that has pterosaurs in it, it's ever been made. Apparently, they have a shrink ray in their back pocket when you're not looking. They zap the head with it and walk away. Because that happened with Walking with Dinosaurs 3D. Mark Whitten and I both gave them the head size, and then the next iteration it got smaller. Next it got smaller. And then David Krintz was doing the renderings for them. He's like, no, I drew it right. It's this big. And they got smaller again. And right somewhere between like one of the approvals for the art and then like the actual production, they shrunk it when they weren't looking, when it was out of the artist's hands. Because they just wouldn't do it. And basically they couldn't get them to agree to us. They couldn't get them to render it smaller for them because they said it's not right. So they had to just like get some intern to shrink the heads for them when no one was looking. So we don't really know, but there's a tremendous obvious trend here in huge heads and a lot of cranial ornamentation. I don't know what's going on. I have some really outlandish, out there, left field, speculative ideas, of which about half of them are testable. But no, not confirmation.
This is fascinating stuff.
Thanks.
And there's obviously many different directions you could go in. I hope you will. The thing that strikes me, though, about looking at these profiles and so on, is the combination of stability and maneuverability, which you didn't say anything very much about.
True.
I mean, level flight is one thing, and
Yep.
taking off is another, landing is another, which you didn't talk about. But where is the center of mass on this guy?
So the center of
It's got to be way forward.
it's pretty far forward. It's not as far forward as you'd think. So one of the funny things about having new
There's a pitching.
Right, there's a pitching issue. So I have worked on that. I can answer your question. I didn't talk about it here because that's getting more into like sort of just for the flight hardcore people. But anyway, so Colin Palmer in particular, he and I have teamed up to do it with Quetzalcoatlus. He's worked on the pitching moments and other animals. He has good algorithms for this. In any case, the upshot is the center of mass in the big edge darket sits a little bit in front of the glenoid. Now you'd expect it might be way out. And the reason it isn't is because the head is not as massive as it looks. It's got big volume. It is incredibly pneumatized. It looks like styrofoam if you break open one of these skulls, which has been done because they found some that were pre-broken. Because they're so pneumatized, areas of the body that are mostly bone, they don't have a lot of soft tissue, are much lighter than you would expect just looking at it visually, and the areas that have more visceral mass are closer to what you normally expect. So thorax and abdomen are contributing more to the mass, and the head less than the mass than you would expect by just eyeing it up. That said, the center of mass would be in front of the glenoid a little bit, and actually that pterosaur up there, the Quetzalcoatl is up there, is supposed to be starting to descend. So the idea Dave and I had was be kind of cool and subtle about it is, well, he's got such a big head, maybe if he just brings the wings back a little bit, he'll naturally go. He doesn't have to do anything, doesn't have to do much. He just puts the wings to neutral and he'll pitch down. And so he's supposed to, the idea was that, we're gonna maybe do this a whole mural, but like there's some baby dinosaurs down here, they're gonna go eat, right? And he's gonna pitch down. Anyway, so the wings in steady flight would have to be forward swept, but it also helps that the head is not as massive as you might think. So you need about 20 degrees of sweep in order to bring the expected center of lift coincident with the center of mass to not have a net pitching moment. For these animals. Now, in terms of overall maneuverability, there's a lot of cool stuff on there, and I do work on that. One of the things that's cool in these animals, you note how the Europatagium, let's get it. Yeah, let me get the stick here. Oh, awesome! I get a weapon. There's a membrane here on the back of the hind limbs. Now, in basal pterosaurs, it stretches across. It is one big Europatagium. And there's a long tail in those guys. But in these guys, there's a short tail, and which actually reduce passive stability a little bit. But it split the Europatagium. That means they're now independent yaw and roll generators. So we've done some estimates of the amount of yaw that you can get off of completely asymmetrical deployment of the Europatagium and Quetzalcoatlus. You get like 90 foot-pounds of yaw off that thing. So it's the maneuverability in the later pterosaurs seems to have been, to a large extent, pushed into the hind limbs, and a lot of the other, basically just basic thrust and weight support, a lot of that is still, of course, that's all in the wings, and some of the maneuverability is still going to be in the wings. But one thing they can't do with this kind of membrane wing that like a bird can is reduce the span a lot on one side versus the other, because it'll flutter. And the aeroelastic limit is probably around a CL of about 0.3 in these things. So they can do a little span reduction, not a lot. So instead, what you want to do is you want to deploy one side in an asymmetric way relative to the other in terms of the moment, and you do that. They can do it by dropping the 1 foot. There's a bunch of other different maneuverability mechanisms there too. They have this cool probatagium they can adjust, which changes entry angle on one side or the other, and of course, lift is very sensitive to entry angle, so that'll spin you around real fast. Colin Palmer and I have also been, and particularly him, have been looking a little bit at counterintuitive methods for passive stability, and there is some evidence that the inboard wing might actually have reflex camber in these guys. If you have a membrane wing that's cambered positively through most of the wing and it goes reflex around the elbow, you actually get a lot of passive pitch stability from that, and a little bit of passive roll stability. And so he and I are actually working on a project together where we're looking at the problem of stability actually in flying animals in general, including performance fossil animals. And our basic model basic conclusion, I should say, that we've come to from what we got so far is that both camps are basically right. So you had one camp of people saying, well, they have to be passively stable because it takes too much neurological control to do it actively. And then the other folks say, well, no, but if you look at the evolutionary trends in the anatomy, they're getting less passively stable over time. And what we think the solution is what's happening is what they're really doing is switching between passive stability most of the time when they don't want to use a lot of energy, and active control for brief moments, which you can probably do briefly, or even don't even bother. If you go unstable for a brief moment to avoid a predation, a falcon can't possibly know where an unstable sparrow is going to go. The sparrow doesn't even know where it's going to go. So they can switch back and forth. So it may be more about being very unstable when you want to be, but then be able to recover very quickly, and having having control mechanisms that aren't very floppy, very stiff controls. So we're looking at that.
We probably should let people go, and you have a lunch to go to, and thank him once again for a really exciting and amazing talk. Yeah.